At dawn, Eleanor Whitmore stepped onto her porch. Fog hung low in the Blue Ridge. Coffee cooled in her hand. It should have been a quiet, forgettable morning. Then her dog froze. Ranger, retired K9, scarred, gray with age, stood at the yard's edge. No bark, no warning, only listening. At the tree line lay a man, bound, bleeding, left to vanish. Most would have reached for a phone. Eleanor reached for memory. Beneath her house, behind a hidden floorboard, a steel locker waited, untouched for 20 years. Military medical kits, old command patches, a leash from wars never named. As she worked to keep the stranger alive, Ranger guarded the door. Not a pet, a soldier, because engines were already turning on the mountain road. And the men who left that body behind had no idea they'd crossed paths with the last handler and the last K9, who never forgot a command. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe legends still walk on 4 legs, subscribe. The house by the tree line and the bark at dawn. The morning arrived quietly in Blue Ridge, North Carolina, the kind of quiet that only mountain towns knew how to keep. A pale mist hovered low between the trees, threading itself through the narrow road that led up into the forest. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, still heavy from the rain that had fallen through the night. It was early, too early for traffic, too early for voices, just early enough for habits. Eleanor Whitmore liked mornings like this. They asked nothing of her. She stood on the small wooden porch of her cabin, wrapped in a faded wool cardigan that had once been her husband's. At 71, Eleanor carried herself with a posture that suggested restraint rather than frailty. She was of average height, slightly stooped at the shoulders, with silver hair pulled back into a low knot that refused to stay neat. Her face was narrow, lined more by thought than by age, with calm gray eyes that observed more than they revealed. People in town called her the widow in the woods. Some said it kindly, some did not. Eleanor had lived alone for 12 years now, ever since the heart attack that took Thomas Whitmore in the middle of a grocery store aisle. After the funeral, she sold the house near Asheville and retreated into the Blue Ridge foothills, choosing isolation the way others chose forgiveness. She spoke politely when required, rarely when not. She attended church twice a year, avoided town gatherings, and never explained why. The neighbors filled in the blanks themselves. She lifted her mug of coffee, already cooling, and breathed in the mountain air. It should have been an ordinary morning. It wasn't. Behind her, inside the cabin, claws scraped softly against the floor. Ranger stopped at the threshold. Ranger was a German shepherd, 11 years old, with a broad chest and powerful shoulders that had not yet surrendered to age. His coat was the classic black and tan of working K9s, though streaks of gray had begun to creep along his muzzle and eyebrows, giving him a permanently thoughtful expression. One ear stood upright, the other bent slightly forward, a souvenir from a long-ago injury. He had once weighed 85 pounds at peak condition. Now he carried closer to 75, leaner but still formidable. Ranger did not bark. He froze. His body went rigid, every muscle locking into place as if an invisible switch had been flipped. His ears angled forward, nostrils flaring, his tail stilled, neither raised nor tucked. Eleanor turned slowly. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. Ranger did not look at her. He was listening, then he barked. Once, sharp, explosive. The sound tore through the quiet like a rifle crack. Ranger lunged forward, paws skidding across the porch boards, barking again, louder now, urgent, the way he hadn't barked in years. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Ranger almost never barked. Not at deer, not at bears, not even at strangers who wandered too close to the property line. This bark meant something else. Eleanor set her coffee down on the railing. It tipped, spilling dark liquid across the wood, but she didn't notice. "Easy," she murmured, though her voice carried no authority over him now. Ranger bolted off the porch and toward the tree line. Eleanor followed. The ground was slick beneath her boots as she crossed the yard, the grass still wet with rain. Ranger slowed near the edge of the forest, pacing back and forth, barking in short bursts. Eleanor pushed past low-hanging branches and saw him then. A man lay partially hidden beneath fallen leaves and mud. He was young, early 30s perhaps, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain and blood. His hands were bound tightly behind his back with a zip tie that had cut into his wrists. One side of his face was swollen, an ugly purple bruise stretching from cheekbone to temple. His jacket was torn open, soaked through, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Alive. Barely. Ranger stood over him, growling now, a low rumble deep in his chest. Not at the man, but at the forest beyond, as if daring something unseen to come closer. Eleanor knelt. She did not gasp. She did not hesitate. Years of habit had taught her to catalog details before emotion had a chance to interfere. Pulse, breathing, bleeding, exposure. "He's freezing," she said quietly, more to herself than to Ranger. Most women her age would have reached for a phone. Eleanor did not. She touched Ranger's shoulder, firm but gentle. "Guard." The dog sat immediately, positioning himself between the man and the trees, eyes never leaving the shadows. Eleanor slid her arms beneath the stranger's shoulders and dragged him free of the leaves. He was heavier than he looked, and pain flared up her spine as she pulled, but she did not stop. When she finally managed to hoist him enough to support his weight, she leaned him against her and began the slow walk back toward the cabin. Ranger followed, glued to the man's side. Inside the house, Eleanor laid him out on the living room floor, pushing aside the rug to expose bare wood. She moved with quiet efficiency, fetching blankets, towels, a first aid kit from beneath the sink. Her hands did not shake. The man groaned as she cut away his jacket. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, then shut again. "Easy," Eleanor said. "You're safe." She wasn't sure if it was true. Ranger circled the man once, then lay down beside him, his body pressed close, head resting inches from the stranger's chest. His eyes never closed. Eleanor noticed the scar on Ranger's flank as he shifted, an old shrapnel wound that had never fully healed. Ranger had been a K-9 unit leader, deployed overseas, trained to detect explosives, track insurgents, and clear buildings before human soldiers ever stepped inside. Eleanor had been his handler, his last. They had both retired after the same mission. Neither of them had truly come home. Eleanor cleaned the blood from the man's face, noting the precision of the injuries. Not random, not clumsy. This had been deliberate. Her jaw tightened. "You don't end up like this by accident," she murmured. As if in response, a distant sound drifted through the trees, a low, rhythmic thudding. Ranger's ears snapped back. His body tensed. The sound faded quickly, but Eleanor had heard it too. "Helicopter," Ranger whimpered, a sound he almost never made, and pressed closer to the man, trembling slightly. Eleanor placed a hand on his neck, grounding him. "It's gone," she whispered. "You're here. I'm here." She didn't say we're safe. She wasn't ready to lie. She finished bandaging the man's head, then sat back on her heels and studied him. Whoever he was, he had been left to die. And whoever had done it had not cared whether he lived or disappeared. That kind of carelessness always came back to clean up its mess. Ranger lifted his head and looked at her. For a long moment, handler and dog regarded each other in silence. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. "We'll do this the hard way." Ranger did not move from the stranger's side. The dog sees what humans miss. Caleb Morgan came back to consciousness in fragments. First, the smell, pine, antiseptic, old wood. Then the weight of pain pressing in from every direction, dull and insistent. When he opened his eyes, the ceiling above him was unfamiliar. Exposed beams, smoke-darkened pine boards, a hairline crack running from one corner like a lightning scar frozen in place. He tried to move. The attempt failed immediately. A low growl answered him. Caleb froze. At the edge of his vision, a large shape lifted its head. A German shepherd lay inches from his chest, amber eyes locked onto his face, body tense but controlled. The dog's muzzle was scarred, the fur around the nose slightly lighter where old tissue met newer hair. One ear stood upright, the other bent forward, as if listening to something Caleb couldn't hear. "Easy," a woman's voice said from somewhere to his left. Calm, measured. "Don't try to sit up." Caleb turned his head slowly. Woman stood near the kitchen counter, washing blood from her hands with methodical precision. She was older, early 70s, if he had to guess, of average height, spare build, shoulders held straight despite the years. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly, not out of vanity, but practicality. Her eyes, when they met his, were sharp in a way that didn't belong to retirement. "I'm Eleanor," she said. "You're in my house." The dog did not move. Caleb swallowed. "Your dog," he rasped. "Ranger," she replied. "He'll stay where he is." Ranger's gaze never left Caleb's face. Caleb became aware of the bandages then. His wrists had been freed, cleaned, wrapped carefully. His head throbbed beneath a tight dressing that had been placed with exact pressure. Not too loose, not constricting. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. "Where am I?" he asked. "Blue Ridge," Eleanor said. "Near the state forest. You were left at the tree line." Memory surfaced, hands forcing him down, plastic biting into his wrists, a voice telling him not to worry because no one ever came back here. He exhaled slowly, forcing the panic down. "They're coming back," he said. Ranger growled again, deeper this time, and turned his head toward the front of the house. Eleanor noticed. She always did. Since Ranger had returned from his last deployment, she had learned to trust his silences more than his sounds. He sniffed the air now, nostrils flaring, then rose and padded toward the front door. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He stood there, muscles coiled, staring at the narrow window that looked out toward the dirt road winding down the mountain. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. "What is it?" he asked. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, careful not to cast a shadow, and peered through the glass. The road was empty, slick with last night's rain, tire tracks already softening into the mud. Nothing moved. But Ranger was not wrong. "He smells something," she said. "Old trail, recent." Caleb closed his eyes. "They dropped me where they did on purpose. It's isolated. They'll wait, see if anyone comes, then they'll clean it up." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "That's what I thought." She turned back to him, studying his face more closely now. Beneath the swelling and bruises, there was a composure there, frayed, but intact. The look of a man used to pressure, to decisions that didn't come with good options. "What's your name?" she asked. "Caleb Morgan." "And what do you do, Caleb Morgan?" He hesitated. Ranger's head snapped back toward him, ears forward. Caleb sighed. "I was a defense systems engineer. Contract work, communications architecture, targeting software." Eleanor's expression did not change. "I stopped 3 months ago," he added. "When I realized what they were actually building," she crossed her arms. "And you took something." "Yes." A pause, long enough to hear the house settle, the tick of cooling metal from the stove. "What kind of something?" she asked. "Data," Caleb said. "Weapons data, portable systems, unregistered, designed to disappear." Ranger's growl deepened. Eleanor nodded once. "That explains the bindings." Caleb frowned. "You're not surprised?" "No," she said. "I've seen that kind of work before." He studied her more carefully now, the way she stood with her feet aligned, toes forward. The shoes by the door, 3 pairs, lined up perfectly, heels flush, not a fraction out of place. A habit burned into muscle memory, not learned late in life. "You didn't bandage me like a civilian nurse," he said quietly. "You layered pressure like a field medic." Eleanor held his gaze. "Drink," she said instead, handing him a glass of water. Small sips. Ranger returned to Caleb's side, sitting close enough that his warmth radiated through the blankets. As Caleb drank, he noticed the scar on the dog's nose, a thin, pale line crossing the bridge. "IED?" he asked before he could stop himself. Eleanor's hand stilled. "Yes," she said. "Years ago, Ranger found it before the detonator was armed." The dog flicked an ear but did not look at them. Caleb lowered the glass. "They trained him well." "I trained him," Eleanor corrected. The house fell quiet again. Outside, the forest shifted, leaves dripping from branches, the faint creak of trees settling after the storm. Ranger stood abruptly and moved back to the door. This time he sniffed the lower frame, then the floor near the wall, then the air again, working in slow, deliberate patterns. Caleb watched, tension creeping back into his chest. "He's tracking." "Yes." "Is it close?" Eleanor followed Ranger's movements with her eyes. "Not yet," she said, "but it will be." She turned and walked toward the far end of the house. Stopping at a section of floor near the pantry, she knelt, pushed aside a woven rug, and ran her fingers along the seam of a floorboard that looked no different from the others. Caleb struggled to sit up. Ranger immediately returned, placing a heavy paw against Caleb's chest. Not hard, but firm enough to stop him. "Stay," Eleanor said. The board lifted with a soft creak. Beneath it, a narrow set of steps descended into darkness. Caleb stared. "That wasn't on the real estate listing." "No," Eleanor said. "It wasn't meant to be." She reached down and flicked on a light. The glow revealed a compact underground room. Concrete walls, metal shelving, sealed containers stacked with deliberate spacing. Everything was labeled. Everything was clean. "I haven't opened this in 20 years, she said. "Didn't think I'd need it again." Caleb swallowed. "You were military." "Federal," she replied. "K-9 operations, training and deployment." Ranger stood at the top of the steps now, watching her, waiting. Eleanor rested a hand on his head. "You remember this place," she murmured. The dog's tail flicked once. Caleb exhaled. "They're not going to stop," he said. "The data I have, if it gets out, people go to prison, or worse." Eleanor climbed back up and replaced the board, smoothing the rug into place as if it had never been disturbed. Then she looked at him, really looked at him. "Then we make sure it gets out," she said, "and we make sure you're still breathing when it does." Ranger returned to his position beside Caleb, settling in without taking his eyes off the door. Outside, somewhere beyond the bend in the road, a bird startled into flight. Eleanor listened. Ranger listened harder. Retired, but instinct never sleeps. Eleanor did not sit when she began to talk. She stood near the window, one hand resting lightly on the frame, eyes scanning the thin ribbon of road that cut through the trees. The light had shifted since dawn. The fog was thinning, lifting in pale strands toward the higher branches. Ranger lay at her feet, alert but still, the way he had learned to be when waiting for instructions that might never come. "I didn't move here to hide," she said at last. "Not at first." Caleb listened from the couch, propped carefully on pillows, every movement measured to keep pain from flaring. He had learned, in the past few hours, that Eleanor spoke only when she meant to. Interrupting her felt like interrupting a calculation. "I spent most of my adult life training dogs," she continued, "not obedience classes, not search and rescue for hikers who got turned around, federal K-9 units, counter-terror, explosives, tracking." She paused, then added, "Places that don't show up on postcards." She turned toward him then, and for the first time since he'd woken, Caleb saw something old and sharp move behind her eyes. Not anger, not pride, focus. "I was a unit commander," she said. "Middle East deployments, joint operations, quiet work, the kind where success meant no one ever knew your name." Caleb nodded slowly. It fit. The posture, the economy of movement, the way she never wasted a step. "Ranger was my last partner," Eleanor said, looking down at the dog. "My best one." Ranger's ears flicked at his name, but he did not look up. He already knew the story. He always had. "He wasn't supposed to be," she went on. "I was supposed to rotate out, hand him off to another handler. Then the convoy was hit." She stopped speaking for a moment. Outside, a branch snapped somewhere deeper in the forest. Ranger's head lifted an inch, then settled again. "The rest of the team didn't make it," Eleanor said. "Ambush, improvised charges layered under the road. Ranger found the first one too late to stop the chain." Caleb felt his chest tighten. "I survived because I was thrown clear," she continued. "Ranger survived because he never left my side. After that, there was no one to give him to, and no part of me willing to let him go." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and withdrew a small, worn rectangle of laminated plastic. She held it out to Caleb. It was an old K-9 training credential. Her name, faded but legible. Her photograph from decades ago, hair darker, eyes harder, expression unsmiling. Ranger's identification number printed beneath it. "I keep it," she said, "because muscle memory lies. Paper doesn't." Caleb studied it, then handed it back. "You don't act like someone who left all that behind." "I didn't," Eleanor said simply. "I just stopped using it." Ranger rose then, stepping forward until his body aligned with Eleanor's legs, his chest angled outward toward the door. It was a subtle movement, one Caleb might have missed if he hadn't spent years watching patterns. The dog wasn't reacting to a sound. He was reacting to timing. Eleanor noticed. Her hand dropped to Ranger's collar, not gripping, just touching, a signal. "What?" Caleb asked quietly. "3," Eleanor said. "3 what?" She didn't answer right away. She reached for the binoculars hanging by the window and lifted them with practiced ease. Through the glass, the dirt road curved into view. 3 vehicles emerged from the trees. Black, unmarked, mid-sized SUVs, the kind designed to blend into traffic while never quite belonging anywhere. They moved slowly, evenly spaced, maintaining distance without hesitation. No flashing lights, no sirens, no plates on the front bumper. Caleb swore under his breath. "That's them." "They're careful," Eleanor said. "Not locals." "They won't come straight. Up," he added. "They'll watch first." Ranger's hackles lifted. He stepped fully in front of Eleanor now, blocking her path to the window, standing tall, still, focused outward. It was the first time he had done that since coming home. Eleanor's breath caught, not with fear, but recognition. "Down," she whispered. Ranger did not move. She tried again, firmer. "Ranger." Still nothing. Caleb watched as Eleanor's shoulders straightened, something in her posture shifting. She raised her hand, not pointing, not gesturing broadly, but making a small, precise motion near her hip. Ranger dropped instantly, flattening himself against the floor. Caleb stared. "You didn't say anything." "I didn't need to," Eleanor replied. "Hand signal, old training." She lowered herself into a chair at last, the movement controlled but slower than it once would have been. Age made itself known in moments like these, when adrenaline tried to outrun joints that no longer agreed. "They're not law enforcement," Caleb said. "No plates, no uniforms, private." Eleanor nodded. "Contractors, or worse," he swallowed. "I was offered money, a lot of it, to sell the data back, make it disappear. And you didn't," she said. "No," Caleb replied. "I refused." "Why?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because I saw the test parameters, urban environments, civilian density models. This wasn't deterrence. It was erasure." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was no surprise there, only confirmation. "Then you did the right thing," she said. "And that's why they're here." The vehicle slowed near the bend in the road and stopped. Engines idled. No doors opened. "They're waiting for something," Caleb said. "For me to panic," Eleanor replied, "or for Ranger to bark." Ranger remained silent. Eleanor stood again and moved toward the hallway, retrieving a small metal tin from a Elsa drawer. Inside were laminated cards, diagrams, and handwritten notes, K9 training protocols, emergency commands, fallback procedures. She thumbed through them once, then slid the tin into her pocket. "Stay here," she told Caleb. He started to protest, then stopped when Ranger turned his head and fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. Eleanor stepped back to the window just as a figure emerged from the lead SUV. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark jeans and a jacket that concealed more than it revealed. His hair was close-cropped, his movements unhurried. He did not look toward the house. Instead, he studied the tree line, scanning the perimeter like someone mapping possibilities rather than reacting to them. "He's not in charge," Eleanor murmured. Caleb frowned. "How do you know?" "Because he's checking angles," she said. "The one who stays seated is the one who decides." As if on cue, a second man stepped out of the rear vehicle, shorter, heavier, with a square jaw and a posture that suggested impatience rather than caution. He gestured sharply, and the first man nodded once. "They'll circle," Eleanor said. "Not today, not yet. This is confirmation." Ranger shifted his weight, eyes never leaving the window. Eleanor knelt beside him, resting her forehead briefly against his. "You did good," she whispered, just like before. The dog leaned into her touch, steady and solid. Outside, the men returned to their vehicles. Engines revved. The SUVs rolled forward again, disappearing around the curve as quietly as they had come. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. Caleb exhaled slowly. They know where I am. They know where we are, Eleanor corrected. She straightened, turning back toward the room. And now we plan. Ranger took position at her side, no longer lying down, no longer resting. On the mountain road, tire tracks began to fade into the drying mud, but neither Eleanor nor Ranger believed for a moment that the danger had passed. Orders that never made it to paper. The forest did not announce the intrusion. It never did. Sound traveled strangely in the Blue Ridge, absorbed by damp leaves, bent by slopes and ravines, swallowed whole by trees that had stood long before men learned how to move quietly. Eleanor felt it before she heard it, a tightening beneath the ribs, a pressure she hadn't known how to name in years, but recognized instantly. Ranger knew sooner. He lifted his head from the floor and rose without sound, every line of his body drawing taut. His ears angled forward, then outward, reading echoes the way Eleanor once read maps. He moved to the back door, sniffed the frame, then turned and met her eyes. No bark, no growl, just a look that said now. They're in the woods, Eleanor said softly. Caleb struggled to sit up, pain flaring. How many? Ranger paced once, then stopped, head cocked. Eleanor watched his breathing, the subtle tension in his shoulders. At least 4. Spread. Wide. Caleb swore. They're trying to flush us. Eleanor nodded. She crossed the room and reached beneath the sideboard, pressing a recessed switch hidden behind the leg. There was no dramatic sound, only a faint hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Outside, small light sensors buried along the tree line flickered to life, invisible to the naked eye, but feeding data back through a system Eleanor had installed piece by piece over the years. Motion triggers, passive infrared, old tech, modified, reliable. Caleb, she said, you're moving. I can't. You can, she cut in. And you will. Ranger, path 2. The dog pivoted instantly, trotting toward the hallway that led to the pantry. Eleanor followed, lifting the rug and opening the hidden floorboard again. The concrete steps below were cool and dry, the air smelling faintly of oil and dust. She ushered Caleb down, supporting his weight with surprising strength. Before closing the hatch, Eleanor paused. Her hand hovered over Ranger's head for a fraction of a second. Lead, she whispered. Ranger disappeared into the trees through the side door, a shadow moving with purpose. Eleanor sealed the hatch and turned back to the living room, her movements precise. She reached another hidden panel behind the bookshelf and drew out a compact case. Inside, flash units rigged with trip sensors, a handheld jammer, and a flare gun modified to emit blinding white light rather than heat. Orders that never made it to paper lived in places like this. The first man broke cover near the old oak at the edge of the property. He was tall and lean, wearing tactical gray that blended too well with the forest. His rifle was suppressed, his posture trained but impatient. He stepped forward, and the ground beneath him lit up in a sudden burst of white. He staggered back, cursing, hands flying to his eyes. A second man moved in from the left, broader, heavier, face set in a scowl that suggested confidence bordering on arrogance. Eleanor recognized that kind of man. He had always believed force solved everything. Ranger hit the perimeter then, bursting from the brush behind them, barking sharply. Not at the men, but away from the house, drawing their attention, pulling them off balance. He moved in arcs, never committing, just enough to make them chase. "Dog!" someone shouted. Eleanor triggered the jammer. Radios crackled, then fell silent. Caleb, hidden below, heard only muffled chaos and Ranger's bark echoing through the trees. He imagined the dog weaving between trunks, guiding the hunters where he wanted them to go, a living compass. One of the men broke off and ran toward the house. Eleanor stepped into view, the flare gun raised. "Stop," she said. The man froze. He was older than the others, mid-50s, hair cropped close, eyes sharp beneath a brow that had learned to hide emotion. His jacket was unzipped, just enough to reveal a familiar patch, shape beneath, one Eleanor had worn herself once. "Eleanor," he said calmly, "you should have stayed retired." Her breath caught despite herself. "Marcus Hale," she said, "you always did like sending other people first." Marcus Hale had been her superior once. Same programs, same desert heat. He was shorter than she remembered, thicker around the middle, but his gaze hadn't softened. Betrayal had etched itself into his posture years ago, the day he'd sold out a unit to protect a contract. "You're harboring stolen property," he said, "and a fugitive." "You taught me not to use words like that," Eleanor replied. "You taught me to use names." A shot rang out, not from Marcus, but from deeper in the trees. Ranger yelped. Eleanor's hand shook, not with fear, with something worse. She moved without thinking, charging toward the sound, the flare gun forgotten. Marcus shouted after her, but she didn't slow. Ranger emerged from the brush moments, later limping, blood darkening the fur along his shoulder. He staggered, then righted himself, standing squarely between Eleanor and the advancing man behind him. "No," Eleanor breathed. She dropped to her knees beside Ranger, hands already probing the wound. It was shallow, a graze, but seeing blood on him, his blood, made the world tilt. She pressed a bandage into place, fingers steadying as training took over. "You're okay," she murmured. "Stay with me." Ranger leaned into her touch, tail thumping once against the leaves. Caleb watched from the edge of the cellar opening, having dragged himself back up despite the pain. What he saw was not chaos, but choreography. Eleanor rose, Ranger shifting with her, the two moving as one, angles covered, space controlled. Marcus Hale stepped into the clearing again, hands raised slightly, weapon lowered, but ready. "You always were attached," he said. "Dogs die. You know that." Eleanor straightened fully now. The shaking stopped. "So do men who choose the wrong side." Their eyes locked. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Behind Marcus, the remaining men retreated, disoriented by the lights, the silence of dead radios, the uncertainty of a handler and a K-9 who still knew the dance. "This isn't over," Marcus said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It never is." He turned and vanished back into the trees, his men following. The forest settled slowly, reluctantly, like a held breath finally released. Eleanor knelt again beside Ranger, checking the bandage, her hands gentler now. "You scared me," she whispered. Ranger licked her wrist. Caleb approached, awe written plainly across his face. "I've seen teams," he said quietly, "but that was different." Eleanor met his gaze. "That's what happens when trust outlives orders." She helped Ranger to his feet. He limped, but stood proud, eyes still scanning the shadows. "They'll regroup," Caleb said. "Yes," Eleanor replied, "but they learned something today." She looked down at Ranger, then back to the trees. "So did we." What was saved was more than a life. The confrontation did not end with gunfire. That was what surprised Caleb most. He sat at the small wooden table near the kitchen window, laptop open, hands hovering over the keyboard, while Eleanor stood behind him, one palm resting lightly on the back of his chair. Outside, the forest was unnaturally still, as if it, too, were waiting for something to finish. "Now," Eleanor said quietly. Caleb exhaled and pressed the final key. The progress bar completed its slow crawl and disappeared. A single confirmation line appeared on the screen, clean and unforgiving. Transfer complete. The data, compressed, encrypted, routed through systems Eleanor had reactivated from memory rather than manuals, was gone, not erased, delivered, split across multiple endpoints, mirrored, time-stamped, and logged in places that could not be quietly buried. Caleb leaned back, eyes closing as relief hit him all at once, heavy and disorienting. "It's out," he said. "They can't pull it back." Eleanor nodded once. "Good." She moved away from the table and knelt beside Ranger, who lay on a folded blanket near the fireplace. The German shepherd's breathing was steady now, his injured shoulder wrapped cleanly. His amber eyes followed Eleanor as she checked the bandage with gentle, practiced fingers. "You held," she murmured to him. "Just like you always do." Ranger's tail thumped softly against the floor. Headlights cut through the trees an hour later, this time accompanied by sirens. Real ones. Blue and red light washed across the cabin walls, reflecting off the glass in sharp pulses. Vehicles stopped at the edge of the property, doors opening, voices calling out procedures rather than threats. Caleb stood stiffly. "That'll be federal." "Yes," Eleanor said. "The right kind this time." The first agent through the door was Sarah Donnelly, mid-40s, tall and angular, her dark hair pulled into a severe ponytail that did nothing to soften her sharp features. She wore a windbreaker marked with agency insignia and carried herself like someone used to being listened to, and disappointed when she wasn't. Years earlier, a whistleblower case she'd backed had collapsed under political pressure, leaving her reputation intact but her trust in institutions permanently scarred. She took in the room with a single sweep of her eyes. The bandaged dog, the laptop, Eleanor. "So," Sarah said, voice even, "you're the one who didn't run." Eleanor met her gaze without flinching. "I'm tired of packing boxes." Behind Sarah, two uniformed officers escorted a handcuffed man into view. Marcus Hale. His jacket was gone, his expression flat, his eyes flicking briefly toward Eleanor before sliding away again. He said nothing. "Your friend here decided to talk," Sarah continued, nodding toward him. "Once his communications went dark and your data hit our servers, his options narrowed." Caleb felt a hollow satisfaction settle in his chest. Over the next few hours, the cabin filled with quiet efficiency, statements taken, devices cataloged, evidence logged. Marcus and the remaining members of his team were led away, faces hidden beneath the wash of emergency lights. At dawn, the last vehicle pulled out of the driveway. Silence returned. A veterinarian arrived mid-morning, Dr. Henry Lowell, a stooped man in his 60s with kind eyes and a weathered leather bag. He knelt beside Ranger, murmuring reassurances as he examined the wound. "Clean graze," Henry said finally, smiling. "No nerve damage. He'll be sore, but he'll heal." Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Caleb watched her sit down heavily in the chair beside Ranger, the fight finally draining out of her. The dog shifted closer, resting his head against her knee. Eleanor's hand came down automatically, fingers threading through his fur. They asked. I wanted protection, Caleb said quietly. Relocation. New name. The whole thing. Eleanor didn't look up. And? I said no, he replied. I'll testify. Publicly. I won't disappear. She glanced at him then, studying his face. That will make things harder. I know, Caleb said, but I didn't survive this just to hide again. Eleanor nodded, something like approval flickering across her expression. They offered me the same, she said after a moment. New identity, new state, quiet life. And? She looked down at Ranger, then at the cabin walls, the scuffed floor, the view through the window where sunlight now filtered cleanly through the trees. I've been quiet long enough, she said. I ran after the convoy. I ran after the funerals. I ran until I forgot what standing still felt like. Her voice softened. This is home. That night, after everyone else was gone, Eleanor slept. Not the restless dozing she'd grown accustomed to, waking every hour, listening for sounds that never came, but real sleep, deep and unbroken. Ranger lay beside the bed, close enough that his steady breathing anchored her to the present. She dreamed of nothing at all. Morning came gently. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen table. Caleb sat with a mug of coffee, reading over a draft statement on his phone. Ranger lay stretched out in a patch of warmth on the floor, eyes half-lidded, peaceful. Eleanor stood at the window, hands wrapped around her own cup. She did not feel hunted. She did not feel finished. She felt present. Ranger shifted and lifted his head, resting it fully against her leg. Eleanor smiled faintly and rested her palm on his skull. What we saved, she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else, wasn't just a life. Caleb looked up, understanding in his eyes. Outside, the forest breathed, and for the first time in 12 years, Eleanor Whitmore allowed herself to believe she would not have to run again. Spring returns to the yard. Spring came back to the Blue Ridge quietly, the way it always had before Eleanor learned to listen for other kinds of sounds. The snowmelt fed the creek behind the house until it sang again, a low, steady music that carried through the open windows. Dogwoods bloomed along the dirt road, their white petals drifting down like small flags of surrender to the warmer days. 1 year had passed since the night Eleanor Whitmore stopped running. The house no longer felt like a perimeter. On weekday mornings, the yard filled with motion, not the sharp, coiled movement of threat, but the clumsy energy of new beginnings. A half-dozen dogs, rescues of various breeds and ages, waited in loose formation near the fence, tails wagging, ears swiveling, bodies uncertain but hopeful. Eleanor moved among them with a whistle and hand signals, her posture relaxed now, her voice steady without being sharp. At 72, she was slower on her feet, but her timing remained impeccable. They called the place Blue Ridge Canine Response, though most people in town just called it Ellie's. The children called her Grandma Ellie. The nickname started with one boy, 8 years old, freckled, missing his 2 front teeth, who had wandered onto the property after school with his mother's old Labrador. Eleanor had corrected him once, gently. He ignored her. Within weeks, the name stuck. Eleanor stopped correcting anyone. She didn't mind it. Ranger watched from his spot beneath the maple tree, lying on his side in a patch of sunlight. Age had caught up to him over the past year. His muzzle was almost entirely gray now, his movements slower, his joints stiff on cold mornings. But his ears still lifted when Eleanor gave a command, and when a child called his name, his tail thumped against the grass like a drum remembering an old rhythm. He was 12 now. Eleanor glanced at him often, not with fear, but with gratitude. Ranger no longer stood between her and the world. He rested within it. Inside the house, one wall had changed. Where once there had been bare wood and shadows, a glass case now hung neatly between two windows. Inside it were medals and ribbons Eleanor had not touched in decades. She had cleaned them carefully, mounted them with simple labels. No dates, no locations, no explanations. She had not put them up to remember the war. She had put them up to remember what came after. Caleb Morgan arrived on a Saturday in late April, his truck crunching up the gravel drive with familiar ease. He stepped out carrying a small stack of envelopes bound with twine. He looked healthier now, broader in the shoulders, lines of strain softened by time and purpose. Testifying had not been easy. It had cost him job offers, friendships, sleep. But he stood straighter these days. "You're late," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "Traffic," Caleb replied, smiling. "And I brought mail." He handed her the bundle. Letters from families who would never know her name. From engineers who had left the industry quietly. From one woman in Arizona who wrote simply, "My son came home." Eleanor read them later, alone. That afternoon, the community gathered near the fence. Folding chairs appeared. Someone brought lemonade. Sarah Donnelly stood near the back, hands in her jacket pockets, observing rather than participating. She looked different out of the field. Taller somehow, less armored. The sharpness remained, but it no longer cut everything it touched. She had fought hard to keep the program funded, to keep Eleanor's name out of reports, to let this place exist without becoming another line item. She had succeeded. At the center of the yard, a simple ceremony took place. No flags, no speeches, just a small wooden plaque mounted to a stone, engraved with a single name, Ranger. A young girl, maybe 10, dark hair in braids, serious eyes, stepped forward holding a cloth pouch. She knelt carefully in front of Ranger and pinned a small metal badge to his collar. It was shaped like a paw print, polished smooth by many hands. "For service to the community," the girl read, voice wavering but proud. Ranger lifted his head and licked her chin. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. Later, as the sun dipped lower, Ranger returned to his place under the maple tree, content. Eleanor sat beside him on the grass, her back against the trunk. She closed her eyes and listened, not for engines, not for radios, not for danger, but for voices, children calling commands incorrectly, dogs responding anyway, wind moving through branches. No whispers followed her into the night anymore. When dusk settled and the yard emptied, Eleanor rose and went inside. She stood for a long moment before the glass case, studying the medals. She touched the frame once, lightly, then turned away. Some orders were never written. Some were lived. Ranger's ears lifted as Eleanor called him, inside. He rose slowly, joints complaining, but his steps were sure. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the yard one last time before following her in. The lights went out. The house rested. And in the quiet, Eleanor Whitmore slept, without fear, without regret, without the need to run. At the end of this story, the lesson is quiet, but it stays. Not every battle in life looks like a war. Most of them happen in ordinary places, on ordinary days when no one is watching. Eleanor did not become a hero because she fought. She became one because she chose to stop running. She chose to stay. She chose to care when it would have been easier to turn away. In our daily lives, we all carry things we think are behind us. Old wounds, old fears, old regrets. But sometimes those experiences are not meant to disappear. They are meant to prepare us for the moment when someone else needs us. You do not need to be young to matter. You do not need to be strong to make a difference. You only need to be willing to show up when it counts. And sometimes the greatest healing comes not from saving others, but from finally allowing yourself to be at peace. If this story touched you in any way, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what part of the story stayed with you. If you believe that courage can return, that broken souls can still protect others, and that it is never too late to find purpose, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories like this together. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you, guide you, and give you peace in your daily walk. And if this message speaks to your heart, write Amen in the comments so we can stand together in faith and gratitude.